Hey friends, welcome back to the Light Up Your Metabolism podcast. Today my guest is Lily Nichols, who is a registered dietitian, and she is an expert in all things pregnancy, gestational diabetes, nutrition for breastfeeding. And I'm so excited that I got her on the show today because I have been wanting to talk about this topic for so long because I don't work with people who are pregnant. There's just too much liability. It's not my area of specialty, but I loved that in this conversation, Lily and I were totally on the same page about so many things. And one of the most interesting things that she talked about was the mainstream recommendations from classic nutritionists or hospitals when it comes to treating and managing people who do have gestational diabetes. I was appalled with the general recommendations. So if you are pregnant and if you're considering getting pregnant, if you're in the breastfeeding stage or you want to have another kid or you're just curious, this is an amazing episode because it is jam-packed with information that you need to know to help support yourself through all those phases of pregnancy and childbirth and supporting your nutrition during all of those phases and what to do when it comes to getting tested for gestational diabetes, options that you have, things that you can say no to, and actual recommendations that are going to help your blood sugar, your insulin, your hormones, your metabolic health instead of actually potentially hurt them. So let me tell you about Lily. She is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition. Her work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and critical of outdated dietary guidelines. She is the founder of Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and the author of 3 books. You guys have to get her books: Real Food for Fertility, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily's best-selling books have helped tens of thousands of mamas and babies and are used in university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses and have even influenced prenatal nutrition policy internationally. So it was such an honor to interview Lily. You can find her at lilynicholsrdn.com. I have linked every single thing in the show notes for you, including her books and her courses she talks about at the end. This is just such a great episode, jam-packed with great information. Send this episode to a friend of yours who's wanting to get pregnant, who wants to improve their fertility, who just had a baby, who's currently pregnant, who's breastfeeding, all those mamas out there. Please send this podcast to them because it's chock full of great information. Thank you to Lily for coming on the show, and thank you to you all for listening, for sharing, for rating the show, leaving reviews. It really means a lot to me. Let's dive into the episode. Hey Lily, welcome to the Light Up Your Metabolism podcast. I'm so thankful to have you here today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'd love to get to know you a little bit better and hear about your story and what brought you to the world of prenatal nutrition, gestational diabetes, and all those things.
Yeah, so it's actually a little bit by accident that I ended up in the prenatal space, let alone the gestational diabetes space. But after I completed all my training and dietetics, licensure and all of that, an opportunity came my way to work for the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program. It's also known widely as Sweet Success. So I worked at the state public policy level with a team of dietitians working on the guidelines for care and nutritional treatment, and then worked clinically for many years under a perinatologist who is a gestational diabetes specialist, running the diabetes education program in our clinic, which was all pregnant women, obviously perinatology. So it was in that setting that I was able to kind of put into practice some of the guidelines that I had worked on. And it was a little disheartening to see how frequently those guidelines did not work for helping control clients' blood sugar levels, which led me down many rabbit holes and long nights of research into how the recommendations came to be. And whether we could do different. And ultimately, I developed a different approach for nutritional management, which we can go into if you'd like, and wrote that up in my book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And essentially what we were able to do in that office, we reduced the chances that our clients required insulin or medication by more than 50%. We had far better outcomes, pregnancy outcomes, so less risk of baby being born larger than average, less prenatal complications, like preeclampsia is a really common complication at all. Oftentimes, the babies were not born larger than expected, which is a typical expectation that the hospital system has on gestational diabetes babies. So it just improved outcomes overall. And that's really kind of served as a, trajectory to boost me into what I do in my career now, which is really digging into where did our guidelines come from? Is there evidence for us to do better? And I, write about that in my other books as well.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have this conversation because I really do want to find out how those recommendations came to be and then how your recommendations differ. But before we dive into that, I would love to talk about what exactly is gestational diabetes and why does it occur in people?
Yeah, so gestational diabetes is essentially high blood sugar in pregnancy. Whether it first develops in pregnancy or is simply first identified during pregnancy, which can mean different things to different people, it's just blood sugar that's higher than average. Another way of defining it is insulin resistance in pregnancy or carbohydrate intolerance in pregnancy. Essentially, these women cannot tolerate a large amount of carbohydrates at a single sitting without experiencing high blood sugar as a result, which points to kind of the intervention that tends to work quite well for managing the condition, of course. But yeah, any of those definitions can apply.
Okay. And so who's at higher risk for having gestational diabetes?
So essentially, anybody who has risk factors for insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes in their family is also at risk for gestational diabetes. So family history of type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, any sort of condition that tends to have an insulin resistant component like polycystic ovarian syndrome, really high risk for gestational diabetes. Women who start their pregnancies at a higher than average weight, our insulin resistance just naturally tends to go up as humans as we are in larger bodies, especially if our larger size is related to higher fat mass versus muscle mass. That affects how efficiently our body processes glucose. So there's many different risk factors, but those are some of the most common.
Okay. And so how is the testing done for gestational diabetes? How does one know that they have it?
So there's different ways that you can test. The gold standard is considered a glucose tolerance test, which is also called a glucola. That's typically performed at 24 to 28 weeks. So essentially you consume a very sugary drink and then they test your blood sugar at different intervals to see what the response was. There's all sorts of different versions of the glucose tolerance test. Different countries do different versions. There's a couple different versions that can be used in the United States. There's different cutoffs. There's all sorts of controversy around the validity, accuracy of the test. Some people just don't want to do it whatsoever. So there are some other alternatives, but generally speaking, the most accepted one is the glucose tolerance test.
Can you talk about some of those other alternatives? Because I'm sure people listening to this show would be some of the people who would want those alternatives, and maybe speak to why people would want those instead of this sugary drink, and maybe talk about the ingredients in the sugary drink if you can.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple different reasons people don't want to do the glucola. For one, some people don't like the additives that are in there. And there are alternatives that don't have these additives, but food dyes, for example, there's like an orange flavored one that has food dyes. People don't want that. Some people don't like that there's brominated vegetable oil. I believe there was some ruling passed that that's going to be eventually removed from the food supply. So we'll see if that also affects the glucola. That can be avoided with certain different flavored ones, or there's some, I'm not affiliated with these brands, but there's the Fresh Test has a glucose tolerance test, which doesn't have those in it. So it's just the glucose, plus like a lemon lime flavor or something like that. You'd have to look at the ingredients on that one, but it has less of the less of the stuff that people don't want.
Okay.
There's also some people who simply do not want to ingest a large bolus of sugar in a single sitting, right? And so as a whole, just the concept of a glucose tolerance test, they don't want to do. So, alternatives, I mentioned the fresh test. You could also do like pure dextrose, which is another word for glucose, measured in the exact gram amount on a gram scale, mixed with water to be equivalent. Some providers are open to that, some are not. If you want to do something that's absolutely not the glucola, I mean, I have my own opinions about the different tests, testing options that are offered. So I'll just talk about some of those and why I don't like those options, and then talk about what I would do if I were to do an alternative. So some people will offer juice instead of the glucola. That's not perfect because it's not pure glucose, right? Fruit juice also has fructose. So it's not the same glycemic response. The whole purpose of the glucose tolerance test is to see your body's response to a pure bolus of a specified amount of glucose. So if you're doing juice, not the same thing. Likewise, a test meal, not the same thing. Jelly beans, not the same thing. The studies that use jelly beans, they actually sent off the jelly beans to a lab to get the exact quantity of glucose. And it's not like an exact, like count out 50 jelly beans. Like in that study, it was like 72 jelly beans. Well, what if you're using jelly beans that are larger or smaller? Like might not be exactly the same. Again, so it comes down to like an accuracy thing. Like the point of the test is to get a specific response to a specific amount of glucose. And if you're not ingesting that or having it part of a mixed meal with protein or fat, it's going to skew the response. So for people who are totally averse, I would just test your blood sugar at home, home blood sugar monitoring. There's different ways to do this, but generally speaking, over-the-counter blood sugar monitor, capillary glucose, finger stick, and you test your blood sugar for a couple weeks fasting and also after meals, and compare your blood sugar response to both sort of the cutoffs for goal blood sugar for gestational diabetic women, and also like what is typically average of a healthy pregnant woman. And I have the graphs of both of those ranges in chapter 9 of my other book, Real Food for Pregnancy. I go through all these different options as well with the research on why I'm making these statements that I'm making on this podcast today, all in that place. But my opinion is like, it would be better off, instead of looking at a single time point, one test meal, right? Test out a whole bunch of different things. Challenge yourself with some meals that are higher carb than typical. Challenge yourself with a fruit smoothie or fruit juice, but also eat a bunch of meals that are your typical, and you'll get to see what is your blood sugar response to these different real life scenarios. And you'll be able to see, like, sometimes you do home blood sugar monitoring and people's blood sugar is off the charts, even when they're eating fairly low carb. Like that's straight up gestational diabetes. You definitely would have failed a glucose tolerance test. It's really good we checked on this. And then sometimes you have people who are very much in the gray area, or some where even if you challenge with a pretty high carb meal, their blood sugar is like 110 or something after the meal, like perfectly normal. And so that's my recommendation, would be to just check your blood sugar, because ultimately it doesn't even really matter whether you have a diagnosis on paper of gestational diabetes or not gestational diabetes. What matters is that your blood sugar is in a healthy range for the majority of your pregnancy. So, some providers may have mixed opinions on whether they'll like quote accept home monitoring as a replacement for the glucose tolerance test. But so you may have to like keep an eye on your blood sugar for the rest of your pregnancy. Like it all depends on how these conversations go down with your provider. But nonetheless, like all for the better that your blood sugar is in a healthier range, and you start to understand how food affects your blood sugar in a deeper way.
Yeah. Do some people get continuous glucose monitors as well?
You can do that. I actually did that in my second pregnancy. I chose not to do the glucola again. I wrote all about my experience with the glucose tolerance test on my blog with my first pregnancy. I should mention that people who tend to follow a lower carb diet, you're more likely to get a false positive on a glucose tolerance test, because your insulin production is in line with what your typical dietary intake is. Our bodies are adaptable. So we've known since at least the 1960s that if you put people on a low carb diet in advance of a glucose tolerance test, they'll likely get a false positive. If you put them on a higher carb diet in advance of a glucose tolerance test and they're healthy, they'll pass because you've just ramped up their insulin production in advance of that, right? So if you're typically eating a lot of carbs, handling a big bolus of glucose is no big deal. Whereas if you eat low carb, your insulin response is going to be titrated to what you're eating. So if you want to do a glucose tolerance test and you're a low carb eater, you probably need to ramp up your carb intake at least 150 grams a day for the week prior to the test to have an accurate response on the test. So yeah, my second pregnancy, I decided not to do the glucose tolerance test. And I checked with a blood sugar meter, also regular blood sugar meter. CGMs have their pros and cons. Nothing is perfectly accurate no matter what. But I also, being my own guinea pig, wore a CGM at least once each trimester to see where I was at, and so some providers will also accept that as an alternative. And now that we have more and more data coming out on CGM and pregnancy, like there's a lot of studies, even in the last year, that have come out on it. More providers are being open to accepting that. But before, when I first started out, like CGMs, even some of my type 1 diabetic clients didn't use a CGM, and if somebody was using a CGM, it was definitely because they had type 1 diabetes. Nowadays, they're much more readily available. There's many different options. They still cost something, but they're a lot more affordable than they were, 20 years ago.
Yeah. So are you able to just rattle off a couple of numbers for us? I do talk a lot about optimal ranges for blood sugar on this podcast. So maybe regular pregnancy versus what would be considered gestational diabetes, so we can get an idea.
Yeah. So of course I have the gestational diabetes targets front and center. So I'll go through those first. But
sure.
So typically for fasting blood sugar, well, there's different guidelines. So it depends on what information you're looking at. I go by the more stringent criteria for blood sugar control that the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program recommends, and most other countries out of the US follow, which is keeping fasting blood sugar below 90 milligrams per deciliter and post-meal blood sugar is below 120 milligrams per deciliter. Other guidelines in the US give much higher ranges. And the reason that organization recommended tighter glycemic goals is because you want to mimic as close to normal pregnancy blood sugar values as possible. So if you look at the CGM data for healthy pregnant women who don't have gestational diabetes, often their fasting blood sugar is in the 60s, 70s, or 80s milligrams per deciliter. And post-meal, it's pretty rare to have a spike that goes beyond 110 often.
Okay. And is that 2 hours after a meal or the highest peak after a meal?
I would say, I think 1 hour after a meal, highest peak is typically like 120. 2 hours after a meal, highest peak is typically 110. But we're often seeing much lower ranges. There was actually a study that just recently came out a few months ago that looked at CGM data in healthy pregnant women. And yeah, average blood sugar over the course of the day was, in the 90s typically. When you factor in all the fasting and all the post-meal readings. So you might have an excursion, a short-term excursion, maybe to the 130s for like 5 minutes or something, but it very quickly comes down to the low 100s or into the 90s. We have actually, like, our bodies actually try to keep blood sugar in the healthier range, even more so during pregnancy, because although there's a physiological increase in insulin resistance in everybody over the course of pregnancy, our insulin production increases to match that. So the ideal ranges for blood sugar are lower than outside of pregnancy for somebody with diabetes, right? Outside of pregnancy, you might be targeting 140 milligrams per deciliter after a meal. In pregnancy, we're targeting lower. We also have officially like lower targets for fasting blood sugar for what counts as hypoglycemia. So outside of pregnancy, we consider anything under 70 hypoglycemia. In pregnancy, that cutoff drops down to 60 because pregnant women just maintain blood sugars at a lower range than outside of pregnancy. So those are all factors that kind of need to be considered when you're trying to determine, like, are my levels normal, or are they optimal, or are they slightly problematic? Like, you kind of want to err a little bit lower in pregnancy.
Okay, that's really helpful. When I work with people, I use really functional ranges that are very close to all the ranges that you just talked about.
Yes.
So that's what I want for people typically on average. But what I see a ton of people who skew towards the lower end of blood sugar, or having hypoglycemia, or having sort of what I think the mainstream or centralized medicine would call it potentially postprandial syndrome, where they're feeling these symptoms of low blood sugar, but their blood sugar is actually in a normal range. And I get a lot of people with those issues, and I know that a lot of them start to struggle extra during pregnancy, and I don't work with people who are pregnant. So I was wondering if you see that often happens during pregnancy, that these sort of low feelings are exacerbated.
What I've found is there's kind of like an adjustment period when somebody starts to get their blood sugar in range, where they've been so used to hanging out at higher blood sugar levels that they feel hypoglycemic symptoms when their blood sugar is, like, maybe it's 10 or 15 points lower than it was before, milligrams
Yep.
per deciliter. But they're feeling those symptoms, and
Yep.
it's almost like we need to work on micronutrient intake, mitochondrial health, to help with their, like, fuel utilization. We might have to help them with things like intake of L-carnitine, for example, to help with, like, fatty acid oxidation. Like, we're supposed to be metabolically flexible in an ideal world where we can kind of go back and forth between, like, okay, there's carbs available, I'm going to burn sugar right now. Low food availability, I'm going to burn either ingested fat or body fat for fuel. And you're supposed to be able to, like, go in and out of those states very fluidly without ridiculous crashes in our energy. So when somebody's having those symptoms, I find that I usually need to kind of zero in on, like, what they're actually eating. For me, I found that a lot of people are just very considerably under consuming protein, or they may be really overly restrictive in their fat intake over time. So, like, they're happy to get their carbs in check, but then, like, they're not eating enough food in general.
And they're
like
not eating enough energy. It's
enough
like carbs
energy.
and fats are energy, and they go high protein, low carb, and not eating enough fat, or they can't digest the fat. I see the same exact thing.
And then, like, if you make some of those adjustments, especially with lower carb, and your insulin production starts to go down as a result, you also start excreting more electrolytes than usual. So the whole, like, concept of keto flu or whatever, you really need to be getting your electrolytes in as well. A lot of our electrolytes play a role in our insulin sensitivity, mitochondrial health, like fuel utilization. So that's what I mean by, like, kind of looking comprehensively at what's going on. I'm like, are you eating enough food? Are you getting enough protein? Are you getting enough carnitine? I mean, red meat is the best source of that, can also be supplemented. Are you salting your food enough? Or is your idea of healthy just like this bland, flavorless thing? When people go from, like, a processed food diet, like, their insulin levels are really high, so you're retaining more sodium and more of those electrolytes. But also your insulin is high, which means you're excreting fewer of them as well. And so you go from that to, like, whole foods. Like, you now have to start salting your food. For some people who go, like, maybe too restrictively low carb, you do need to consider your potassium and magnesium intake, which may have gone down if you really cut very severely your plant food intake, or you're not being really intentional about getting enough potassium, for example. So, maybe you do better slightly low carb, but we need to, like, build in more, like, avocados or, other high potassium foods. Tomato paste, ridiculously high in potassium. So sometimes it takes a little look at the quality of the diet, and then we can work on that,
Amazing. You're speaking my language. I love hearing you talk about all these things that I find to be essential in helping people with these issues. I usually start with minerals, and then I'm big on working on circadian rhythm, because there's so much circadian rhythm dysfunction. People are throwing themselves off with their light environment
Totally.
accidentally, and not getting outside, not enough red light. I have a little red light therapy literally on my stomach right now because I'm
There you
inside.
go. Yeah.
But yeah, so amazing information. So thank you so much for sharing that. And so, okay, we started talking about strategies to support people who have lower blood sugar. Let's talk about this, the guidelines and strategies that you were talking about earlier, that, centralized medicine is pushing, versus what you find to be helpful for your clients and patients with gestational diabetes.
You mean relative to like the food recommendations?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So brace yourself. The
Okay.
conventional recommendations for pregnancy nutrition as a whole, but gestational diabetes as well, are just an offshoot of our conventional dietary guidelines. So first of all, that needs to be stated. So the high carb, moderately low protein, obsessively restrictive in fat is also the norm in pregnancy as well. The main focus for the conventional pregnancy guidelines for gestational diabetes are to keep your carbs at a relatively consistent intake throughout the day. So really the primary focus is on splitting your carb intake evenly across 3 meals and 3 snacks, lean protein, low fat. Um, that's essentially
Are they trying to make
it.
people worse? Because it really, like, eat 6 times a day when you have diabetes. I can't.
Well, so the challenge here is that they have an arbitrary minimum recommended carbohydrate intake in pregnancy of 175 grams a day. And
Minimum?
so that is split across those meals. Now, of course, if somebody has like a estimated higher calorie requirement, you're going to give them more carbs as well, because 45 to 65% of calories need to come from carbohydrates, just like the rest of the guidelines, right? So some of these meal plans have like 200, 220, 230 grams of carbs for a woman with gestational diabetes. Like you split that up over the day, and sometimes you have meals that are like 45 or 60 grams of carbs at a sitting, which when you think about it, like toddler logic, somebody who's failed a glucose tolerance test of maybe 50, 75, 100 grams of carbs, why are we then giving them a pretty similar amount of carbs at each meal and expecting them to have normal blood sugar levels? Like it just does not work.
Doesn't.
Um, so what ends up happening is you have, women who maybe follow these recommendations and their blood sugar is high, but then they are warned not to go lower in carbs because you cannot go lower, they say, than 175 grams. The response is that you add blood sugar lowering medication or insulin. Like, seriously, this is the norm. This is the norm of practice. So I'm like the first dietitian who publicly spoke out against the 175 gram minimum for carbohydrates. I mean, I had to do a ton of research to go into this because there's all sorts of controversy over going low carb and ketosis and all the things. But that's really the whole reason that I wrote Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, because the conventional advice makes their blood sugar worse. So a lot of times you have women, so instead of, eating more of other foods, you just have them start themselves overly restricting their food intake to try to like keep their blood sugar in range. They either keep eating the same and end up on insulin or medication, or they end up starving themselves. Neither of which are,
Good for the
an
baby.
ideal scenario here.
Yeah.
Not saying that every single case can be nutritionally managed. We do have cases, of course, where we need the help of blood sugar lowering medication or insulin. But like I said, like we were able to reduce our reliance on that by over half by just giving them a diet that was matched to their carbohydrate tolerance. And this doesn't necessarily even have to be super restrictive in carbs, but maybe instead of 60 grams of carbs at a meal, they can handle 30 grams of carbs or 20 grams of carbs, and we make it better quality carbs, and maybe we have them eat their carbs after their protein or whatever, like, considering the nutrient timing and everything, and we can get really excellent results without like starving these people or force feeding them a ton of carbs. So
Wow. I
yeah,
cannot believe that those are the recommendations. I also can't believe I didn't know that. I've mentioned this, but I don't work with women who are pregnant, just because of the liability and all that. But
yeah.
it's it's unbelievable. I usually get people post having the baby, and a lot of their history is I had gestational diabetes. So does having gestational diabetes give someone an increased risk? And what does that actually mean? Is it actually just a risk, or is it that there was already something metabolically brewing, time is going on, we haven't healed it, and now it's just sort of like pregnancy made it show up, and now 20 years later it's showing up again? Is that kind of what we see going on?
Essentially, yes, to the latter,
Yeah.
portion. So
Hmm.
when you look at adult women diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, the number one independent risk factor for development of that condition is having a pregnancy with gestational diabetes. Now, it's always like which came first, but when we look at the data on one of the options I didn't discuss earlier on like diagnosing gestational diabetes is looking at a first trimester hemoglobin A1C or your
Mm.
A1C levels, which tells you like an average of your last 2 or 3 months or so of blood sugar readings. So with a high A1C, anything 5.7% or higher, so pre-diabetic range, your chances of failing a glucose tolerance test, meaning testing positive for gestational diabetes, is upward of 98.4%. So
Wow.
in like I mentioned earlier, I worked in a very progressive kind of office, very focused on gestational diabetes. I mean, we had all the gestational diabetes from that region of Los Angeles were referred to our clinic because we specialized in it and we had really good outcomes. And our protocol for diagnosing gestational diabetes, like as part of first trimester labs, everybody got a hemoglobin A1C. This is actually in the Sweet Success California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program guidelines, by the way. One thing they definitely got right was pushing more progressive and earlier diagnostic criteria. Because you
Yeah.
think if you wait till 24 to 28 weeks, you've now had almost 2/3 of the pregnancy elapse with no no
Yeah.
checking for anything. So we screened everybody with A1C. If they tested in the pre-diabetic range, then they were treated as if they had gestational diabetes. They never did a glucose tolerance test. If
Mm.
somebody passed that early test, we still would follow up at that
Yeah.
later time point to see did something develop over the course of pregnancy or did A1C miss it? A1C is not always perfect, right?
Right.
But it was so rare that our office would ever do a glucose tolerance test because we caught everybody in the first trimester, okay? So my opinion, based on the data, my clinical experience, is the vast majority of gestational diabetes cases are pre-existing blood sugar and insulin issues, essentially undiagnosed prediabetes or insulin resistance that was going on beforehand. We're catching it in pregnancy. Very, very rarely do you have something like metabolically disastrous just happen to appear during pregnancy. Pregnancy is like the great revealer. We
Yeah.
also just happen to be testing for these things, right? It is a
Yeah.
stress test on your body. You can have somebody with like decent blood sugar insulin regulation, but maybe their pancreas didn't adapt well to pregnancy, where their insulin production didn't go up enough. That is like a rare exception, I think, to what I'm discussing here. But for the most part, we're seeing this was a long-standing blood sugar and insulin issue. This person had borderline elevated blood sugar. They had high insulin levels. They had insulin resistance going on beforehand. We caught it during pregnancy. And to your second point, does it predict like later risk of type 2 diabetes? Absolutely. There's anywhere from a 30 to 70% chance that these women will then go on to develop type 2 diabetes in the 5 to 10 years post delivery of their baby. And also, you don't have to be a statistic. I think it's like the warning light coming on in your car. It's like, check engine, got to go get some maintenance here. Like, you may have to work harder than the average woman to maintain healthy blood sugar metabolism. But I do believe many of these cases, they can avoid a prediabetes or type 2 diabetes diagnosis. You may have to work a little extra. So a lot of the things you've been talking about and we've been talking about on this call, these are the same things that you're going to have to keep in mind long term. So eat well, right? Like, eat a sufficient amount of protein, especially don't overly restrict fat, eat high quality carbohydrates at a level that your body can tolerate without having huge glucose excursions, focus on your minerals and micronutrient intake, move your body, build some muscle mass. If you can, breastfeed your baby. That dramatically reduces the risk of type 2 because you become very insulin sensitive when you're breastfeeding. You use a ton of glucose in the production of breast milk. So that's huge. With a baby, it's difficult, but prioritizing sleep however you possibly can. I mean, I'm a parent of two, so, I get it. The light exposure you're talking about, exposure to morning light, avoiding the blue lights in the evening, the red light therapy, like all of those things continue to matter for, long-term prevention of type 2 diabetes. I do run, an online course on gestational diabetes, and once people are a member, they're there forever. And so I hear back from a lot of women. Some women have been with me for like 4 pregnancies now through the course. And some of them really do struggle with their blood sugar long term, and they really have to put in a lot of extra work, maybe add in some nutritional supplements, or really be like on it with their strength training and really on it with food quality, where some
Stress
other people,
management also.
exactly. Yeah. Some other people might have had like a more mild case, and it's really not something they have to be quite as on top of. But, there are guidelines on checking your blood sugar annually, to see if they call it converting to type 2 diabetes, but to see if you've converted to type 2 diabetes, or to see if you're kind of on the spectrum of developing prediabetes.
Gotcha. Do you guys use fasting insulin tests to look at the level of insulin resistance? And is that something that you use in your clinic?
So outside of pregnancy, yes. During pregnancy, there are not official guidelines on like what is considered normal for fasting insulin levels or post-load glucose load insulin levels.
Okay.
Generally speaking, we could talk about all the ranges on fasting insulin being totally off, right? Conventionally, it's like, over 25, you might have a problem. Like, no, like over 9, it's pretty clearly insulin resistance. It's arguable.
I use 6 or above as
as exactly,
like starting to be like, you're probably going to have symptoms at 6 or above.
Yes,
what I see clinically,
and I like to see for optimal, like below 5, if at all possible, even potentially lower than that, right? So it's on a spectrum. In pregnancy, though, that gets tricky because you have an increase in insulin production naturally. Your insulin production can like double or triple by the 3rd trimester. Now, some of that is relative to what's being consumed. People who are eating a lot more carbohydrates are going to have to produce a lot more insulin to cover it. So it's hard to say like exactly how much, because some of those estimates are based on the data that we have from women with type 1 diabetes who are pregnant and how much their insulin requirements increase over the course of pregnancy. So until we have we would need trimester specific criteria to define normal and abnormal insulin levels in pregnancy. And those have not been created. Like that just doesn't exist yet.
Right.
It should. Like, it makes a lot more sense, right? Because, just measuring glucose doesn't tell you a whole lot. You can have, like, I had a client one time, passed her A1C first trimester with flying colors, like 5.2. And then later on went on to develop gestational diabetes. She was somebody who, even eating low carb, she needed really, really high insulin. I suspect that she had high insulin for a long time. So like, you can have really high insulin levels, which keeps your blood sugar at a great range, but you add in this, as I call it, like a stress test of pregnancy. she wasn't able to like further increase her insulin production enough. She needed pretty high dose insulin shots to keep her blood sugar in
Wow.
range. It was wild. And it took many years, but in her later years after having kids, she went on like a pretty big health transformation, dropped like 80 pounds. It was wild. And it wasn't even that her diet quality was poor. She had great quality diet. I think it just must have had to do with quantity or something, and maybe all these other factors that we talk about, right? All those other
Yeah.
little lifestyle things that kind of like add up, and maybe some, genetic predispositions or whatever. But she was able to do a pretty big transformation. But yeah, just to give you an
Yeah.
example of like, you can have great blood sugar and have really out of whack insulin levels, which is not great.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we see leptin and insulin levels rising years before the blood sugar actually even changes, oftentimes. So that's why
Yeah,
people can go in and be like, oh, my A1C is like, your A1C could be good, but it's like there's all these other things. Maybe the insulin is you have double, triple, quadruple the amount of insulin to manage the blood sugar and it's doing a
exactly.
good job. But then it's kind of like the pregnancy tips the scales in the other way, and then it just can't keep up. So yeah, love what you're saying there. So let's talk about prevention. I am sure you're gonna agree that this type of thing is preventable. And what would you recommend for making sure that someone has healthy blood sugar, insulin, metabolic health in pregnancy?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say you need to be doing some work ahead of time before pregnancy, if at all possible. So get your blood sugar and insulin levels as well in a good range in advance. That naturally helps to get your weight in a healthy place in advance, right? Like it helps set the stage for healthier hormone production, better egg quality, better endometrial receptivity for implantation. Like it improves fertility. We see in
Hmm.
women actively trying to conceive, even those who have blood sugar in this slightly higher, but like in the normal range. So not quite pre-diabetic, but on like the upper level of normal blood sugars, they have delays in conception compared to women who have levels in the optimal range. So work on all of that ahead of time. Prioritize your protein intake, arguably above all else. I think this is the biggest lever we can pull nutritionally, is to get that protein intake optimal. That naturally helps to kind of reset those satiety cues. You're providing many of these amino acids that are vital for your mitochondrial health. I mean, you really got to get the protein in a good range. And that means eating arguably more than double what the current recommendations are. You need enough protein. I am like a broken record about protein, because
Me
I
too.
actually think it's more important to hit that than to go from the angle of restricting carbohydrates.
I
And I
agree.
used to approach things from like, keep your carbs in check. And now I'm like, you're not going to be able to keep your carbs in check unless you hit your protein. So let's focus on what you should eat more of. Quality carbohydrates also huge. I think we have, the health space is uh, always full of like new dietary boogeymen. However, I do think there is value in having plant foods in your diet as well. Everybody tolerates different ones, so pick and choose or whatever, but there is a role for fiber, slowing down the absorption for carbohydrates, helping our microbiome. There's just a lot that fiber does in our system, even if we want to argue whether it's an essential nutrient or not. At the end of the day, the highest quality, most nutrient dense carbohydrates happen to have fiber in them. So eat those
Hmm.
berries, those non-starchy vegetables. If you digest them well, legumes, they're actually quite nutrient dense. Nuts and seeds, like mix in some plant foods on top of like plenty of high quality animal proteins. You want to think about your micronutrient intake. Vitamin D deficiency is a major risk factor for gestational diabetes. Magnesium deficiency as well. You could go all down the
Those
line, like
often go hand in hand.
chromium, thiamine, yeah, all
Yep.
these things. Exactly, magnesium and vitamin D. They're kind of interrelated in how magnesium is required for a lot of the different enzymes for vitamin D metabolism. So if you're low in one, you're possibly or likely low in another. So those would be some major areas to focus on. I'd also add supplementation wise, inositol has some really strong data on reducing the risk of gestational diabetes, also helping manage gestational diabetes. It is very, very widely used for women with PCOS. They've done trials where they look at it head to head with metformin. You often get equal or sometimes better results with inositol. So that's something that I think would be wise if you know you have like an insulin issue already, get on the inositol ahead of time. It's safe for fertility purposes. It's safe in pregnancy. It's safe in breastfeeding. We have trials in adults of both sexes where they use inositol in type 2 diabetes. Like, it's just kind of a wonderful thing with like no risks. Like, there's no toxicity of inositol. If you take a massive dose, you might have some GI upset, but that's at levels that are double or triple what most people are taking, what most studies use.
I haven't seen a huge change in any of the clients that I've ever put on inositol. And maybe it's because I didn't do it long enough, but I just have not really noticed a big difference. I know that there's so much research, but it's just clinically not what I see.
What kind of a dosage?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but what is the recommended dosing?
So in pregnancy, I'll say I see pretty huge benefits with inositol. Like, somebody who's struggling with their fasting blood sugar and where like we've tried all the things and it's not working, oftentimes inositol will do the trick. So most of the studies use about 4 grams a day, which is 4,000 milligrams. Some of the trials use less, like 2,000. Some use more, like 6,000. For me, it's not something that is like, of course, the only thing we're doing. Like, I'm focusing on all the nutritional aspects too, but I've seen pretty good results. So it might just depend. Also, considering for pregnancy, you have limitations on what supplements are considered safe. And so some of the things people use for reducing insulin resistance, like berberine, for example, is contraindicated in pregnancy. It's arguable. Some people use it in fertility, but if you're actively trying to conceive, you don't want to be on it, so some of those things get a little bit trickier. So I've had great results with inositol, but there's so many things where it like depends on the client, right? Some people might do better with like alpha lipoic acid over inositol. There's some pretty, promising research on L-carnitine as a supplement. Again, that's found naturally in red meat. So I try to get people to get enough red meat. And now I'm kind of rambling, but so many different things you can do for prevention, like build your muscle mass in advance of pregnancy. Strength training is excellent. Get your sleep in line. Basically all the things we've talked about this whole podcast episode also apply to optimizing your blood sugar, preconception, and reducing your risk.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I really like to circle back to the fiber conversation, I feel the same way as you, is that I don't see people long-term thriving without a lot of fiber. I see it potentially helping at first if someone's like super, super sensitive gut and they can't tolerate it. But long-term, especially for women, I see it start to have like there's like a negative sort of things that start to pop up, including gut issues, histamine issues. And so I see the idea of, and I've seen this with my clients and with myself, this has happened too, where I kind of just get lazy to cook like vegetables all the time. And I find that I do better when I focus on adding in more fibrous type foods. And this is also really supportive for detoxification. And, we're so bombarded with toxins and chemicals. I'm really high in mold. I lived in Florida for 15 years. So now I'm working on that. But having fiber, and then also you talked about before, really good fat, and making sure we have really good bile flow, that's going to bind to these fat soluble toxins, get out these, used estrogens and things like that. We want to have a really good flow of things out of the body on a consistent basis. So I find those things to be supportive as well.
I 100% agree for all those reasons. So I won't repeat them. But that is a big thing that people need to consider is gallbladder health. And you're not going to have great gallbladder health if you're not consuming enough fat. You need some bitter flavors to help stimulate the gallbladder flow as well. This is why so many places around the world, they have specific bitter herbs or bitter vegetables that are often consumed with a meal or consumed after a meal, you want to stimulate that gallbladder flow. You have to be eating enough fat to stimulate it, and you need some bitter flavors. So that also can include foods like dandelion greens and kale and like radicchio and some of these like kind of bitter
Arugula.
vegetables,
Yeah.
lemon juice and grapefruit and vinegars and things that get that flow. And then you also need, since so many toxins are metabolized and excreted into the bile, you need something to bind onto it. So
Yeah.
I'm with you on the fiber. And I think that's something that, you know, you could do low fiber for short term. Like you said, people with a sensitive gut, I have certain foods where I know like I don't really tolerate the fiber or whatever it is in this
Yeah.
particular food, like kind of makes me gassy. That's not something I'm going to choose, but that doesn't mean I forego all
All of
fiber
it.
as a whole.
Yeah.
Like I'm just going to choose the things that happen to agree with my system. But I'm with you. I see it affecting people's gut health, their hormone balance for sure. It can drive estrogen dominance if you're
Yep.
not getting enough fiber over like a long period of time.
Yeah.
On the flip side, I will say there's some people, especially those who kind of err on the under eating side,
Mhm.
where like they get so much fiber that they're excreting too many hormones. You can see this
Interesting.
sometimes in women with hypothalamic amenorrhea.
Mm.
They're already on the under eating side of things, and then they're getting like lots and lots of fiber. They're just like pooping out their hormones literally.
Oh
So
my
it can
gosh.
like, it has to be in balance. But I think, yeah, we have to kind of get out of the tribalism that our dietary recommendations have fallen into these days.
Absolutely. So, what about breastfeeding? You talked about already how it helps to make you insulin sensitive. What goes on metabolically in breastfeeding that is important for us to know? And then, what are the nutritional requirements or recommendations for breastfeeding?
Yeah, so part of the reason that breastfeeding can be so helpful on the blood sugar perspective is that it is a highly energy intensive process. You're burning like 500 calories a day in the production and excretion of breast milk. So you become very insulin sensitive, especially in early postpartum. That said, because it is such a energy expensive process and you're also excreting essential nutrients into your milk, you
Mhm.
need more food. Like your calorie and protein requirements are never higher than they are during breastfeeding, especially the early period of exclusive breastfeeding.
Yeah.
They actually finally did a study. It was at 3 to 6 months postpartum in exclusively breastfeeding women, and their protein requirements, first time they've ever looked at this postpartum, this was only a couple years ago, their protein requirements were higher than a typical female athlete,
Wow.
which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For anyone who's ever had a baby, you're just like ravenously hungry when you're nursing.
Mhm.
So some considerations, a lot of people have better carbohydrate tolerance because you're more insulin sensitive. So you might not need to be quite as restrictive. Like if you erred on the low carb side in pregnancy, you might have more wiggle room for carbs proportional to you need more food, right?
Yeah.
I still am really heavy on emphasizing protein and getting, whole foods, traditional foods that have enough fat with it. So unless you're obsessively taking the protein or the fat rather out of all your protein foods, if you leave your yolks and your eggs and the skin on your chicken and the fat in your dairy and so on and so forth, you're probably going to be good there. But you also, again, may have more wiggle room for carbs simply because your energy requirements are so much higher. You will need more fluids and electrolytes because you're excreting milk, right? You're not just
Mhm.
losing the fluids, you're also excreting electrolytes every time you nurse. So you need to go even more, be even more reliant on getting enough electrolytes. That includes salt, potassium, magnesium. You're excreting a lot of those in your milk. So, a lot of the recommendations are kind of an overlap for at least what we're talking about, optimal
Yeah.
nutrition, like generally and during pregnancy. You just have to acknowledge you're going to need more.
Okay.
The longer that you breastfeed, the greater the metabolic benefits to the woman. So we see lifelong reductions in type 2 diabetes, breast cancer, metabolic syndrome, um, just overall like hormonal balance in like their later years. The challenge with the long-term breastfeeding is that you can become more nutritionally depleted over time, because this is
Mm.
an extra expenditure of nutrients. So this is why when we're talking about eating more food, I'm also like, eat more nutrient dense foods. I think many women really benefit from staying on some form of supplementation for, at the very least, the period of exclusive breastfeeding, the first approximately 6 months. But if you're breastfeeding long term, like maybe you breastfeed your kids into toddlerhood, you're still going to want to be focusing on your nutritional repletion, because you're still expending those extra nutrients every time you nurse.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And that is consistent with what I see because I do work with people who are breastfeeding and they're like, I feel like I'm so hungry, but I don't want to, and I don't want to eat carbs, but they're like, or I'll lose my milk supply. It's like, well, we want to do things to maintain the milk supply, of course. And then you are going to get a little bit more wiggle room, like you said. So that's really helpful
Yeah,
to
and
know.
I'll just add to that, if
Hmm.
people are, sometimes I have women who, like, they're pretty well keto adapted and that they feel great doing that. They may be totally fine continuing with that same sort of dietary pattern
Okay.
through nursing. Again, you're going to have to go more heavy on the electrolytes because you're also excreting more in your urine as well as your breast milk.
Right.
But it's kind of a misnomer that low carb means low milk supply. What I
Mm,
see when that happens, I'm typically seeing it in somebody who was not well adapt, like they're
right.
not keto adapted or whatever at all, and they're like, I need to lose the baby weight, and they go on this like crash
Yes.
diet, which not only is low carb but is also low calorie, or they
Mm,
very quickly go from like they're eating 300 grams of carbs a day and they're like, I'm going to do keto, 20 grams of carbs a day. Like, that is a really, really big stressor on your body to adapt to that while you're
yeah.
also nursing. Like, your supply will be affected. So if you want to experiment with
Mm,
going lower carb while you're breastfeeding, you need to adapt to it very gradually. Either you
right.
already eat that way and you're probably fine, or you need to adapt to it very slowly and make sure you're not in a caloric deficit at the same time,
Mm.
because your supply will decline if you're significantly under eating or making really drastic dietary changes. So that's the major consideration there that I just want to mention for people.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that makes total sense. And I see that like not in pregnancy too. And so, or not in breastfeeding, is that people making these like really intense shifts. Like they hear about something and they're like, I want to try this. And it's a huge change. Just keeping in mind that while you're pregnant or while you're breastfeeding, these are heightened stress times. You're probably not sleeping as well after you have the baby. So just keep in mind that your stress load is already really high, potentially, and then these nutrient deficiencies. And I see a lot of people, especially if weight is involved and they want to lose weight, they they think about restricting. And it's just they immediately think, well, I can't be eating carbs, I can't be eating multiple like more than 3 times a day or even 2 times a day. And I really like to urge people to think about let's send signals to the body that it's safe, let's nourish it, and let's move really slowly. And maybe, you know, within the first 6 months of having a baby, this isn't the world's best time to think about like that classic weight loss approach via restricting. It's like maybe let things come down a little, work on the foundations, the sleep, the sunlight, the stress reduction, getting nutrient dense food, keeping up those mineral stores, and seeing what happens from that approach, getting some movement and getting back to your fitness routine instead of just cutting calories, cutting carbs, cutting out meals.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of that for me, I've found, is people getting enough protein starting in the morning. Like,
Yes.
when you have a baby, everything is a little bit crazy because you're on call 24/7. So you're always prioritizing the baby or the family over yourself. And so you have women who go through all these things happening in the morning. It's like 3 hours have gone by and they still haven't eaten. The
Mm,
signal that sends your body is a stressful signal. You're going to have a cortisol surge to keep your blood sugar sufficient enough for energy levels, but that throws off your hormones long term, and you're going to end up like, whatever you haven't eaten in the morning, you're going to eat all of that and then some later in the day. in non-ideal ways usually. So if we can get women to get enough protein first thing in the morning, that kind of interrupts that cortisol response, sets up their, satiety signals, blood sugar and insulin regulation for the day, and a lot of other things just go a lot better. I think people don't realize if they get in this cycle of under eating, your thyroid is going to downregulate. Like you're going to put yourself in a hypothyroid state, and that's going to make it even harder to lose the weight long term. So it does feel weird that when I have these same sort of conversations with clients, I see this pattern of under eating, even though they feel like they're, at an unhealthy weight. And it's like we have to interrupt the under eating in order for their body to feel safe enough to lose that weight. And for, breastfeeding women in particular, I like to emphasize the whole 9 months on, 9 months off concept, where it takes time for your body to lose the weight gained during pregnancy. And, the hormones of lactation can make it more challenging. Like everyone says, oh, right, you burn 500 calories a day breastfeeding, like weight loss should be easy. Well, you have all this hormonal stuff going on. Our bodies are not calculators. Mm-hmm. And so for some women, they're going to hold on to a little extra weight until they're done nursing, because their body, it's a safety thing where we need to feed this baby. We need to have these reserves on hand here just in case you don't eat for a couple days and we still need to keep the milk production up, right? For some, it does take actually weaning the baby whenever that happens for those last 5 pounds to come off. And I don't think it's worth it for you to go to extensive means to try to lose the 5 pounds, nor do I think you should wean your baby earlier to try to lose the weight, right? You have to find this kind of middle ground, but it really starts with nourishing yourself first and foremost.
Yeah, I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. I love chatting with people in the blood sugar space, doing slightly different things, but there's so much overlap. And I love that what you're seeing with your people and what's helping them is also consistent with what I'm seeing. So let us know. Okay, you talked about your book, that you have multiple books, so we'll link those in the show notes. And what else do you offer for people who are in, I think, any stage of pregnancy?
Yeah. So, first of all, I would say if you're pregnant, I would read Real Food for Pregnancy. Chapter 9 has that whole section on the gestational diabetes screening options. There's information about prevention. If you develop gestational diabetes, then I would get Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. That book is under the assumption you've been diagnosed. I'm going to talk you off the ledge of your pregnancy is ruined and everything is terrible and all the fear mongering that you hear, and give you very specific, actionable advice, which will be significantly different than whatever meal plan you get or hospital nutrition class you get. Okay. Actually effective meal plans that actually taste good. Okay. So, I would get that book. If you need additional support, I do run an online course, the Real Food for Gestational Diabetes online course. I've been running it since 2015. Yeah, I've been running it since 2015. So over 9 years now. And that has, informational videos to walk you through things. There's a lot of advanced training in it that's just simply not information I could fit into a book. So we have a whole training on lowering fasting blood sugar. That's the number one question I get from people is, how can I lower my fasting blood sugar? I've done all these things. My mealtime readings are great. How do I target the fasting? And the advice you'll get from a doctor or a typical clinician is to add a bedtime snack. And that's not always the appropriate advice, or you need to be a lot more specific. So full training on that. I have office hours.
Have you tried with the red light therapy and morning sunlight?
That is one of my recommendations as well. Awesome. Yep. Focusing on that can sometimes help. Yeah. What's tricky about fasting blood sugar is there's about 1,000 different potential variables that can be going on. So I kind of help to delineate the typical patterns and help you kind of troubleshoot more effectively. So instead of just throwing spaghetti at the wall, you're going to okay, I'm seeing this pattern, so I'm going to try this, this, and this. Okay, this hasn't worked. All right, then I'm going to try this, this, and this, and try to get you to a solution sooner than later, right? Because they often only give you a week or two to work on this before they put you on insulin or medication. I mean,
Oh,
with
wow.
pregnancy, we have a very limited time frame. You know, you're
Yeah.
diagnosed like usually right before your third trimester,
Hmm.
or in your third trimester, and you've got what, 3 months maybe, and so we need to find something quick. Anyways, so that course is definitely a good resource. There's office hours with me in the private Facebook community. So if you have questions, I answer them directly in there. There's 21 days of meal plans at 3 different levels of carbs, so you can
Hmm.
make it fit for whatever your carb tolerance is. And yeah,
Amazing. Well, we'll link all that in the show notes and how people can follow you. Thank you so much for coming on and for your time today.
yeah, thank you.